There are a couple of things that make your photos noisy, and contrary to what most amateur photographers believe, ISO isn't one of them. And in this video, I'm going to explain where the noise in your photos actually comes from and how you can use that knowledge to eliminate noise and create professional level landscape photos that you can be proud of no matter what the conditions are, even when there isn't much light. Now, when I first started out with landscape photography around 2 years ago or so, I watched loads of landscape photography videos on YouTube, I read a bunch of books, and I was told time after time again that if I use a high ISO setting on my camera, my image is going to have loads of horrible noise. And it's just not true. And ISO supposedly causing noise has cropped up a couple of times with the photographers in my landscape mastery program as well. So I went down the rabbit hole on this one, and well, there's a reason why everyone believes that high ISO causes noise, and to understand why, we need to very quickly go back to 1974. So in 1974, the ISO standard for film sensitivity was established. Photography film started getting labeled as ISO 100, 200, 400, rather than the previous standards like ASA and DIN. And when film photographers are shooting with film, which is made up of light-sensitive silver halide crystals, the higher the ISO rating of the film, the larger the grains of crystals that are used. And so these larger grains of crystals are more light sensitive, and so it becomes easier to expose the high ISO film with less light. And of course the trade-off is that using higher ISO films where the crystals are bigger, the crystals have become more visible in the end image, and this shows up as grain. So a high ISO film stock will show more grain than a low ISO film stock, literally because of how it's been made. Now, film grain and digital noise are not the same thing, but for whatever reason they've been linked together, and so most people still believe that shooting at higher ISOs leads to more digital noise. But this is wrong, and I got tricked by all this nonsense as well. So I used to almost exclusively shoot at ISO 100 because that's what landscape photographers do. That was until one day when I literally couldn't use ISO 100 on my camera. I couldn't use ISO 100 because the back of my screen was literally black and I couldn't compose my image. Now, as I'm setting up this shot, I had to use f16, otherwise my shot would have had a soft background. There wouldn't have been enough depth of field in the shot. I had to use a fast shutter speed because it was windy and I needed to freeze the action in the scene. So reluctantly, I increased my ISO to ISO 800. I assumed that the image was going to be unusable, it's going to be full of noise, and well, it wasn't right. There's barely any noise in the image at all. So if using a higher ISO setting in your camera doesn't necessarily create noise, we need to answer the question, where does this noise come from? Well, it turns out that noise is created when your camera sensor very literally, very simply, hasn't collected enough light. And let me just reiterate this point, right? The level of noise in your images has nothing to do with your ISO setting. You can think of it like this, right? Imagine the pixels on your sensor as being tiny buckets that collect light that is flying through the air towards your camera sensor. Now, the light entering these buckets doesn't arrive in a smooth stream. There's a level of randomness as to which bucket, when multiple buckets are next to each other, is going to capture that photon of light. So if we had a very simple sensor that was, say, 10 pixels by 10 pixels wide, and we had 100 photons of light hit our sensor, then some buckets are going to capture more of those photons than others. And so some pixels are going to look darker because they've collected no photons or very few photons, and some pixels are going to look lighter because they've collected more photons than the pixels around them. And so the image from the sensor isn't going to be very uniform, it's going to be a little bit all over the place, and that appears to us as noise. Now, the alternative of this is, right, if you fired 10,000 photons at this very same sensor, the level of randomness as to what pixel catches which photon is going to be much less. The randomness is going to be much less. This is going to give us a much more uniform image, which is going to appear to have no noise. And that is why a shot of a scene with lots of light taken at ISO 500 is going to have a lot less noise than a shot of a scene where there isn't enough light at ISO 100. All ISO is doing on our cameras is amplifying the signal that's coming from our pixels. So when you raise your ISO, the noise that's already there becomes more apparent because we're just amplifying what already exists. So that's what's called shot noise, and we resolve it by throwing more light at our sensor. But what about that weird green noise that you get when you increase the exposure of your shadows when you're editing and you push it way too far. Okay, so have you ever tried to increase the exposure of your shadows in Lightroom only to be met with weird green smudges or other color artifacts on the screen? Well, this is called chrominance noise, and it's caused by your raw editing processor rather than your camera sensor. And I'm going to explain how to get rid of it in a second, but it exists because your camera doesn't collect the color data of the scene that you're shooting with every single pixel. Instead, through the use of a Bayer filter, each pixel captures color data for either green, red, or blue. Now, since each pixel only records one color, your raw editor, like Lightroom, uses algorithms to fill in the missing colors so that each pixel can represent a mix of green, red, and blue in its final form when it's finally displayed on your screen. So within Lightroom, every pixel that has collected red color information, Lightroom must guess at its green and blue values, and then it adds them together and gives the final end RGB color. Then for a green pixel, it's got to guess the other two colors, and then the same for a blue pixel as well. And in bright, well-exposed areas, this works great. But in the dark areas of your scene, these guesses by your raw editor become less accurate, and errors in those guesses lead to kind of random colors that weren't actually there being displayed. And the chrominance noise is often green, simply because your camera sensor has more pixels that collect green light data rather than blue or red light data. So when the demosaicing algorithm for your raw editor tries to fill in all this missing color information, it uses the neighboring pixels to estimate those missing values, and because half of those neighbors are green, the educated guess that it leans into are, well, the other ones are probably going to be green as well. It does this when it's uncertain. So with all that said, how do we fix this problem if we encounter it when we're editing our photos? Well, the easiest thing to do is to use the color mixer in Lightroom. Use the sample point color tool to select the green color that you want to get rid of, and then reduce the saturation of it. So that's how to get rid of chrominance noise. But if a lack of light is causing noise rather than our ISO settings, what can we do to eliminate that noise when we take the picture in the first place? So to create a clean image, we want to increase the number of photons that are hitting our camera sensor. And we do this so that those pixel buckets become full and the randomness of the light hitting them becomes insignificant. And this is where we get over the signal to noise ratio, and we end up with noiseless, or mostly noiseless images. Now, to achieve this, there's only really a handful of things that we can actually do. First off, if you are dedicated to shooting at f16, like most amateur photographers out there will try maybe f8 or even f5.6. And you got to remember here that for every full stop that you open up your aperture, you're doubling the amount of light that's hitting your sensor. So sure here, right, the balance is the depth of field that you're getting in your shots. But if you can squeeze a little bit more light through the front, literal light through the front entrance of your lens, then absolutely it's something to consider. Next up, you want to experiment with your shutter speed. So every time that you halve your shutter speed, you double the amount of light that's hitting your sensor. So very practically in the real world, if you go from 100th of a second to 150th of a second, especially if you've got in-body stabilization in your camera, well, it might not seem like much, but you've actually doubled the number of photons that you're collecting. You've doubled the number of photons that are hitting your camera sensor. And sure, a lot of the time when we're doing landscape photos, we want to be razor sharp, so we need to use a shutter speed that freezes the action. But sometimes, if you've not got that much movement in your scene, a slow shutter speed can lead to a silky waterfall or gentle soft clouds moving overhead. And so a slow shutter speed can be used there absolutely with no issues. And something that I've seen inside my landscape mastery training is that I often speak to photographers who, for whatever reason, always shoot with a polarizer on the front of their lens. Now, of course, polarizers can have a nice effect when they're used correctly, but most people don't realize that they cut between 1.5 to 2 stops of light from entering your camera. So if your CPL filter isn't absolutely essential to your composition, and it's dark, you're trying to get more photons on your sensor to reduce the level of noise that it's producing, take it off. It's probably not all that necessary. Every stop of light matters when you're fighting shot noise from a dark scene. So now that you know how to create noise-free images, watch this video to learn why your photos may even look soft, even if you get your noise and your exposure absolutely correct.